All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. It's a pleasure to introduce Xaq. Before I introduce Xaq properly, I wanted to tell a little anecdote. As a graduate student, when you meet your advisor for the first time, you would like to read your advisor's mind. And of course, your advisor would like to read your mind too. And so the two of you will probably settle to watch each other's behavior. And from that behavior, you will try to infer the mind of the others. And what Xaq will teach us today is that you have to make one more assumption, and then you can actually read the mind. That suspense, I will leave it at that strongly, and what that one assumption is. And so it's a pleasure to introduce Xaq. So Xaq came to do computational neuroscience starting as a physicist. He got a degree at Princeton University, playing with quantum computers and on the side, and not quantum computers, but the idea of quantum computers. And so then he, as a postdoc, he moved to a biophysics program at Harvard University. Then he worked with retinas, so from quantum computers to retinas. And he realized that doing experiments is really hard. And so he decided to move to theoretical neuroscience. And he did a postdoc then at Columbia University and then later at Rochester. And then moving up the ranks, he got a job now at Rice University and Baylor in Houston. And where he also moved up the ranks. And so now he will tell us about how you will be able to read the mind of the advisor. All right, thank you, Xaq.
Thank you so much, Ralph. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for your hospitality. I've had a wonderful day talking to people here, and I look forward to talking to you, having your questions and any discussion points you want to raise. I'm open. We can interrupt as you like. That's part of the fun part of actually being live. And if you're here over Zoom, there's the camera. Hi. Also, feel free to interrupt with questions. I'm open to that. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about rational thoughts in neural code. And this is work that has been done with a number of people. This is a close collaboration theoretically with Paul Schrader. And this work is the brainchild of Zhongwei Wu, Saurabh Daptardar, Minhei Kwan, and Yizhuo Chen. And I'll show you a bit of experimental data, which was collected in the lab of Valentin Dragoy and analyzed in part by Neda Shahidi. And there's a large number of other people who've also contributed to the ideas here, and I'm grateful that we've gotten to work with all of those. And also, it's nice to have some money to do this stuff. So what I'll tell you about today is I'll first introduce a framework, a broad framework for understanding coding and inference and action, and how all that works together as kind of holistic picture of what the brain might do. And then I'll introduce a tool that we developed, which basically does mathematical mind reading, and we call it inverse rational control. I'll talk about how we can use the results of that tool to analyze neural data and thinking about these three overlapping processes of encoding, recoding, and decoding. And then finally, I'll end with just a hint of some neural data that suggests how this could be a very fruitful approach. And I know that this is a diverse audience. So again, if you need some clarification, please don't be shy. Okay, in neuroscience, there's a lot of sensory neuroscientists who measure the brain and compare that to measurements of stuff in the world, like what you're seeing or hearing or smelling. And you also have motor neuroscientists who measure the brain and then compare that to the joint angles or the muscle activations. But much of the brain is in between the sensory and the motor. And so we can still measure the brain, but what are we going to compare the neural activity to? So we like to measure a thought. The way that we do this is based on a model of the way that the brain models the world. So we imagine that the world is going along. There's a state of the world represented by this white circle, and it evolves over time from left to right. And you don't get to observe the world directly. You only get indirect sensory observations. And you can synthesize those observations, collect them over time, into an estimate of what you think is in the world, which we call a belief. Okay? And now, if the events in the world corresponded to events in the brain, then this would be easy to understand. But in fact, individual events in the world can cause many possible events in the brain. And conversely, a single event in the brain could correspond to many possible events in the world, which means that neural computation is inevitably statistical in nature. And that makes things more complicated, but it also provides us with some interesting mathematical predictions. So let's go back to this model of how evidence is coming in. The key assumption that we're going to make, which is actually true in physics, is the Markov property. That is, the change in the state of the world depends only on the state of the world. Okay, and so if you represent the state by x, then you have the probability of x at time t, given all of the past history, is just a function of the previous time step if we're in discrete time. Okay, now if you're in a world where you know everything, this is valid. But if you don't have the full state space, then you might be missing some things that actually affect that probability, and then you lose Markovianity. But you might be able to augment your state space until you have enough information in there to capture the behavior. Otherwise, it's an approximation. So we're going to make the approximation that the brain thinks the world is Markovian. And that allows us, it may be in an expanded state space. That allows us to allow the brain to update its evidence in an online fashion. That can include memory, that can include predictions, whatever you want, as long as it's in the state space. Now, how does the brain take what it observes, which it assumes comes from some noisy distribution P of O given X, and turn that into a belief about the world? Well, we're going to represent the belief as the probability of the current state given all of the evidence that you've ever made, observations that you've ever observed. Okay, and this equation here, this is the hidden Markov model update equation. And basically what it does is it says, well, see, this is your current belief. This over here, P of X t minus 1, given previous evidence, that was yesterday's belief. And so you see, given yesterday, and all of the things that might have happened from yesterday to today, this is a transition probability. And then updating your probability by the likelihood of what you just saw today, you can get today's belief. Okay, this is a standard equation, the hidden Markov model equation. Now, don't let people tell you otherwise. Not anything is possible. That equation that I wrote down can encompass, all of the dynamics of the universe, but that's wicked complicated. And so our brains assume that not anything is possible. And that's a good thing. Whose cursor is that? Some mine? Yeah, that seems to be mine. Interesting. So the brain has to simplify in order to interpret the world. And the way that we mathematize that is by using a formalism called probabilistic graphical models. Who here has heard of probabilistic graphical models before? Who here has heard of an easing model before? Okay, that's a probabilistic graphical model. Who here has heard of a probabilistic graphical model? Okay, good. It's a way of decomposing a joint probability distribution as a product of interacting subparts of that distribution. So for the easing model, this would be like individual pairs of spins that are coupled by some function. And you can rewrite this instead of as a product over factors as e to the sum over energies. And then you have coupling energies, which I should probably swap out that slide for this one for a physics audience. So in a graphical model, we call it a graphical model, because you can make a graph of the interactions. Here, every circle represents a latent variable. And every line, or actually here I'm using hyper edges, which are like these squares, which is an edge between 3 variables or between 4 variables, that represents a coupling energy or a factor. This is called a factor graph. So here's 3 variables that are denoted. We have a coupling factor C1, 2, 3. And then you can have singleton factors, which are like biases or magnetic fields in an easing model, which would bias the state of a single variable. And then if this is a model, a mental model of the world, and all of these are latent causes in the world, and the interactions represent the physics of the world, what is connected to what, then based on your evidence down here, you might try to infer what the properties of one of those other circles is. That problem is called inference. And then the other problem that you might face is figuring out what graphical model describes your mental model. So that's what we call learning. Now, a common one that we deal with is a pairwise Markov random field. So the classic easing model is of this form. So we have 3 variables here, 2 edges between them. And while you do inference, you can imagine unfolding the information flow over time as these things are influencing each other, even if it's a static world. But the influence of when you turn on one, let's say you want to know what the influence of this piece of evidence on the top node is, then you have to compute something. And that computation can evolve. This is like a computational graph. It can evolve over time until at the end you reach some equilibrium, and that tells you what the actual final state of the system is, what the equilibrium is. Okay, now those lines can be all sorts of structures. And so, oops, I put them on top here. So that one up there is kind of a circulating flow diagram. So there's a lot of different structure that you can put into these graphical models. I'm not going into detail about the structure right now, but just the idea that there are nodes represented, but representing individual variables and lines that represent information flow. Okay, so now we're going to look at how all of those states of the world, which are now structured according to our model, they will all influence your belief about the world. And if you have a good mental model of the world, then the structure of your belief should in some sense match the structure of the latent variables in the world. You have a good physics model in your head. Sometimes we have a bad physics model in our head. And of course, we're all in this endeavor to try to learn a better physics model in our head. Now, so the observations that you get, they actually pertain to different aspects of your estimate of the world. So the arrow is fanning out here. Another key ingredient that I want to point out here is that I've couched all of this in terms of probabilities, because the world is, as far as we understand it, stochastic. And so there are things that are happening that you're not able to perfectly predict. You just capture all of that by that Markov property, but it still is a probability distribution. And your observations are not perfect. So together, that means that you have uncertainty. And so if I tell you, give me a guess about how many fingers I'm holding up, you might have a best guess and an uncertainty associated with it. So that's at least 2 numbers. How many fingers am I holding up behind my back? Okay, so now we can, let me just introduce that we care about uncertainty, and not just in the casino. All the time, we are weighing pieces of evidence according to its reliability. So one task that we actually have in my collaborators lab is catching fireflies. And I don't know where you grew up, but where I grew up, that was a really fun thing to do in the summer. Fireflies are these little bugs that light up just at dusk, and you can try to run around and catch them. And they're really slow, so they're easy to catch if you can find them. And the problem is that most of the time they're dark, so you can't see them. So you see the target flash on, and then it flashes off, and you're not sure exactly where it is. Now, one strategy would be to go right up to your best guess at where that firefly was. The problem is that 50% of the time then, the firefly will be behind you. It's better to be a step removed so that you can gather new evidence about the next flash and where it is now. And so that's in fact what we do. Right? You use your uncertainty to choose how to act in the world. Your actions depend on uncertain beliefs. That means that these beliefs in the world should be really represented by more than one number per latent variable, at least a guess and a confidence about it, maybe more, and maybe covariances. Like I think these 2 things might go together. The other crucial aspect of our mental model of the world is that it's nonlinear. And so the rules of physics evolving over time, things bumping off each other. That nonlinearity has to be reflected in how we update our beliefs based on the evidence. And it might be hard for neurons to actually implement those rules in one step. So instead, the brain might use a series of intermediate steps just to use the limited palette of computations that it has and convert that into the final decision to go from one time step to the next. Now, it also need not be just, so this is happening at all times. It also may not be that the number of auxiliary computations you need is the same as the number of beliefs that you have. There might be many more. You expand the space and you do computations up there. And there's actually in the brain no belief that's really localized. This is our model of what the brain is doing, but the actual physical substrate is some neurons doing neuron things. So really physically, you have neurons connected to neurons through these complicated connections. And we're just interpreting this as if there were a belief there. But doing that interpretation allows us to make hypotheses about what the brain should do, even if the way in which it's doing that is complicated and distributed across many neurons. So this is a way of interpreting actions of the brain. Now, finally, speaking of the actions, in this model, you are acting based on your beliefs. And an action is something that takes you from your belief that acts on the world, that changes the world state. And that's the green arrow here. And of course, there's no belief in the brain. So this is really coming directly from the neurons, right? But it's a convenient way of thinking about it, putting all of that together. This simple trellis diagram, which is itself a graphical model, describing the state of the world and the state of the brain evolving over time as you get information from observations and actions. And so to summarize the way that we're thinking about this, you have latent variables about the world, beliefs that are distributed across neurons, performing implicit inference through those nonlinear computations, and selecting actions through nonlinear dynamics that are operating on statistics or different ways of summarizing the belief, the probabilities that the beliefs mean. Okay, so this is kind of a compressed way of saying that whole framework that I just introduced. So at this moment, I will pause and ask if there are any questions about the broader framework of how to think about this computation of a brain situated in a world. Yes, sir.
So in this framework, plants would have beliefs,
Sure.
right? I mean, anything that responds to its environment, maybe even weather, I'm not sure. I mean, there's a pretty low bar for having a belief here.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay.
I have no objection to that.
Okay.
The crucial thing is whether there are choices that that agent, plant or rock or weather, has that influence the future in a way that can be understood deliberately. And we're going to get to that next. So there's a kind of implicit intentionality that I haven't introduced yet. I've just said the action is just the thing that takes you from the state of the organism or system into the world. And I haven't put any additional criteria on it. I will next.
Does a belief by definition in this context of a plant have to be updatable then for it to be a belief? Because a plant that turns towards the sun can't learn that, you can't have like a fear conditioning where the plant becomes afraid of the sun, for example. Like you couldn't shock the plant.
It's okay if, I mean, it's changing, but it's okay if it's not perfect.
But I guess is it a belief if it's hard coded?
Well, it depends on what you mean by hard-coded. I think that this is going to be a longer philosophical discussion. Maybe we can come back to it either at the end or over dinner.
Sounds good.
Yeah, because I don't want to go down too far in the plant hole. That wasn't a planted question, was it? Okay. Okay, so hypothesis. The brain is matched to the world. The brain makes a mental model of the world, and that's very useful. This is an old hypothesis. This goes back to the esteemed Hermann von Helmholtz, who proposed that the brain is performing unconscious inference using a mental model of the world. And so what we're introducing here is the idea is, what if the brain is wrong? And this might be an example, what you just said might be the plant being wrong. What if the plant is wrong, or the agent is wrong? Wrong, but rational. And what do I mean by rational? What I mean is having good reasons for the beliefs that you have. You make the wrong assumptions about the world, but you're doing the best you can under that wrong assumptions, under those wrong assumptions. Okay, so let me give you an illustration of this. How many of you drive? If you don't drive, do you ride a bike? Okay, so I want you to do a little demo. We're all going to do this together. You over Zoom too. Imagine that you're driving down a highway, 2 lanes each way, and you're in the right lane. And there's a slow car in front of you, and you want to move to the left lane. I want you to hold the steering wheel with your hands. I want you to close your eyes. And I want you to make the steering wheel movements to go from the right lane to the left lane. Ready? Go. You're still turning.
Really slow.
You're on a tricycle. So everybody that I saw died. And that's because what you did was this. Tell me if you did something differently. You turned and then you turned back. Right? Is that what you did? No? Some people know? Well, okay. Turn and then turn back. Okay. Okay, so maybe, this is rare, but there have been a handful of people who do this. Don't die. What happens if you do what I just said? You turn and then you turn back. You've just turned the car and now you're going straight diagonal across traffic into the oncoming cars. That's why you're dead. What do you have to do? You have to turn the car, straighten it out, cross the lane, turn back the other way, and straighten out again. So you made an S turn. Almost nobody does that. A couple people did recently, and they had just gotten through a driver's class. Why don't we know that, most of us? First of all, poll. Who actually didn't die? All right, congratulations. Your gene pool will live, the rest of us. Why don't we know that? And those of you who aren't dead can't talk. Only the dead speak now.
Visual cues.
Visual cues. We don't drive with our eyes shut. We get feedback. So what I just asked you to do was to make a prediction by closing your eyes and taking away the visual cues. You are moving in a way or predicting what you think will happen. And you're wrong. You have the wrong idea of what it takes to drive. And usually that's not a problem because you drive with your eyes open and you do get the visual cues. You're like, oh, okay, I better switch back. So this is a way of demonstrating that you have a wrong mental model, but you were acting in accordance with that mental model. And you could ask, well, why were you doing that? And I don't know, we can think about that. But this is what we ask the animals to do. We ask them to make predictions about what their good behavior should be. And then we figure out what justified that action, what rationalized that action. Okay, so here's our framework for thinking about the way that animals behave. We have a brain, and the brain is getting information from the world. Here's the world state. Gives the observations to the eye, gives rewards, like banana juice or whatever, to the brain. The brain uses its observations to update its beliefs, and also, and this is the crucial new thing, to update its estimates of values about those beliefs. Which states does it think are good and bad? Which ones will provide more banana juice? And which ones will crash my car? And from those values, you pick the one that maximizes your expected value. That's the action. You pick an action that's going to do that for you into the future. That's accounting for all future things that might happen. And that affects the world state. So it goes in this loop. This is classic reinforcement learning. Okay, so there's a whole field of computer science that is all based on this idea. It solves Atari games, it plays chess, it wins Go. All of this is based on the same core framework here. Okay. Now what we're doing is we're saying that the brain is doing that, and we are watching the brain do it. And all of that is based on some kind of internal model that the brain has. And we'd like to measure all of those properties to figure out what is the best model, which I'm going to parameterize by theta. Okay. Here's how it works. So it's based on the idea of a Markov decision process, which assumes that you have a Markov world, and you make sequential decisions to maximize rewards. Your decisions are your actions. Your current world state is observable in a regular Markov decision process, but the future is not known. So your actions have to account for what might happen in the future. So you need to know transitions and rewards, and then you can derive a policy from that and a value. Now, in reality, we don't get to observe the world state. We get observations, and those are uncertain. So those partial observations. Now, the world state currently is not known, but your certainty about it, your probability distribution is known. You don't know what your future uncertainty will be. You don't know the future state either. So now this is equivalent to an MDP where the state that you're basing your decisions on is not the world state, but a belief state, a probability over the world, given your observations. You have belief state, belief transitions, not rewards, but expected rewards. And then you can again derive a policy and value. So what inverse rational control does is it figures out what were the assumptions that justified a set of actions to a certain situation. So we assume a rational agent who has the wrong assumptions. And we infer which internal model would explain those actions under the observed observations. And then from that model, we can estimate, or in the process of estimating that model, we estimate what your latent belief dynamics are over time. What do you believe at any given moment? And you can imagine that that would be important because that is essentially measuring a thought. And that's what I started with. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to measure a thought to compare to measured neural activity and figure out what kind of mental computations are happening? There's a couple related ideas out there. Inverse optimal control infers dynamics. If you know the rewards, what the animal thinks is rewarding. Inverse reinforcement learning infers what rewards it likes, assuming the dynamics. And here we do both. And we do so in a partially observed setting. So here's our trellis again, now with some labels on the nodes, and also indicating what is observable and what is latent. So in the top trellis, the world state is empty, meaning the animal doesn't know it. And it's figuring out its own beliefs and choosing actions. In inverse rational control, we as scientists get to observe the world state. Turns out not to really matter, but we don't know the belief state of the animal. And we have to infer the belief state of the animal. So in practice, what we do is we maximize the probability of everything we observe experimentally. We have the actions and observations, which are here and here. We estimate the parameters theta of the internal model, the mental model that the animal has about the world. And we also have to infer latent beliefs that we don't get to know. So we have to marginalize or integrate over the probability distribution of that latent belief. And what we do finally to figure out theta is optimize the marginal likelihood, which is given by this, optimizing it over theta. So figure out what's the best model to maximize the probability of our data. And technical stuff, we use a Markov structure that I described a little bit with the expectation maximization algorithm and an analytic gradient that we can calculate exactly. And this is the decomposition of the Markov model using that diagram that we know breaks down because the arrows tell you causality. And if you know the causes, you don't need to condition on anything else. Okay. Another way of thinking about this is that we have a whole family of agents, and we parameterize that family by theta, which is essentially which task they solve best. Right? This is the policy, one of the ingredients that we need here is down here, the probability of choosing actions from a given belief. This number here is what is optimal for maximizing your rewards. And so without that, we don't know what the probability of actions is. But if you assume that the animal is doing the best it can, given its model, that defines implicitly this pi, this policy. And so we maximize that whole likelihood to find the best interpretation. And in practice, like these are big calculations. We have to use computers to do it in many cases. But you can do things like discretize your belief space, or you can use a parametric family like a Kalman filter, or maybe, and this is work for the future, we can learn a general representation when the state space is just too large for us to actually solve this with modern methods. So this is called simultaneous representation and reinforcement learning. Okay, I'm just gonna jump through this. If you want to know more technical details of how to do this in practice, we can talk about that later. Okay, so any questions there? Yes.
So in your schematic of the model,
Yep.
there is no line that goes from the belief through the action to the next belief, so that there's no green arrow that points to the next belief, which is kind of what we did with the wheel, right? We kind of connected the action directly to the belief of the next step. So is that negligible in this system, or how does that work?
So very astute observation. The way that you can think about this is if you have a deterministic action, if you are the one choosing your action, then the belief is sufficient for that action. And the information that the belief sends to the next time still contains that information. So you don't need an extra arrow because the information's already there. If, on the other hand, you have a stochastic action, like sometimes you meant to do this, but you spin some other way, then you need to observe that. Then your action or the outcome of your action could be in the world state, and you get an observation about it, which is how the information comes back down into the belief. You could also just put a direct arrow there, but that breaks the symmetry, and I like symmetry. Good question. All good questions.
So speaking of symmetry, this is very forward in time analysis, like this causes that next thing. But in quantum physics, there's a lot of creative work where you think about states propagating backwards in time or boundary conditions, both future and past. A lot of very interesting things happen because of that. Is that of all interest or relevant in this case?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, the future is known here because the policy is derived under a mental model that extrapolates into the future and tries to calculate the total expected future reward the best you can. So that's how this comes in. The memory is not necessary in this case because we've assumed that everything is a sufficient statistic from the past. But you can do different kinds of approximations on top of that, or you can say that I'm not able to predict the future perfectly well. I want to break that and just say I only have a limited look ahead. And then you'll get a different policy as a consequence of those assumptions. So the nice thing about this framework is you can design what suboptimal assumptions you have, what wrong assumptions you have, and put them in and figure out what the consequences are for behavior. Yes.
So in order to assign beliefs, you had to impose your own framework for this model on the animal.
Yes, this is a model-based interpretation of animal behavior.
So you've assumed that its model is of such and such a kind, and you just don't know the values of some weights or couplings or something in its model.
Correct. You can also assume different families of models. You could say, I have superstitions, or I don't contain uncertainty, or any kind of structurally distinct models, you can put them in here too. You just have to define them. Whatever model you want to define, you can put in here.
Right. And you really don't have any idea how well what sort of reality that has. Like, does it describe what's going on inside the animal? Who knows, right? It's just, you've cooked up something.
Correct.
And
correct.
So what I didn't see in this is an evaluation of how good your model was. You're talking about how to tune it, but how do you evaluate whether it's adequate?
So you can do the usual thing with any kind of data science, model comparison, hypothesis testing. You can see which one is a better explanation of the data. What is the, I mean, we have the whole probability here. I mean, it should do the marginal probability. We have this whole probability, and you can put in different data and say which one is the best explanation. You can say what is the likelihood of that. You can do predictive distributions. If I say, what will I predict the animal will do next? Is that a good model or a bad model? It's the usual data science stuff. But you should do that. One should definitely do that. It's crucial to do that. Otherwise you say, oh, look, the best model of a whole stupid class of models is, you know, X. Well, is that any good at all? So yeah, that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a particular application of this to a task that we actually have animals performing, which is foraging. Foraging is a classic task where an animal is going around and gathering rewards, and it has to decide, you know, it's got rewards at different locations, and it has to decide, should I stay or should I go? And if I do go, when should I go and where should I go? In this case, it's trying to find food or like foraging for berries in a partially observed setting. So it doesn't know how good the food source is currently. It doesn't know how long it's going to be till the next food is here or the next food over there. So that's our setting. And so to be really concrete, we have these boxes, these feeding boxes, which have little pellets in them. And the animal can go over to a touch screen, touch the screen, and if there's food available, then it will be delivered. But if it touches the screen and there's no food, then it was just like, oh, it looked through the bushes and it didn't find any berries. Okay. And so the red here would be reward available. You go and you open the box and you say, yes, there's some food. And then there's no reward available for some time. And then it goes for a little while, reward becomes available again. It might disappear again. This is what we call a telegraph process, a switching process. And then the animal might open the box over here or touch the screen and get no reward because there wasn't reward available. This whole thing is a Markov process. Now we also have multiple boxes in the room. And the animal's foraging strategy is to go between those different boxes. So at some point it might get the food and then decide, all right, well, I know it's going to be a little while before food comes back here. I'm going to go to the other box. That takes some time, some energy, and then it goes over and it opens that new box and says, yes, I got some food. In addition, we provide some partial evidence about what that latent state is. So it's hard to see here, but there is weak evidence, and we can control the reliability of the evidence in terms of the color shown on the screen. So when the screen is red or redder, then it's more probable that there's food. And when it's blue, it's more probable that there's not food. So we designed this task. We have monkeys actually doing this task. We're recording wirelessly from their brains while they just move around freely in the box. And we are trying to learn their parameters. And so what I'm going to show you now is doing this on a synthetic monkey, not a real monkey, but just an imagined monkey that's doing this task. So in this case, the monkey knows the structure of the world, but has wrong assumptions about these parameters, like how often the rewards appear or disappear. The strength of the evidence, how reliable is that evidence? How much does it subjectively cost to switch between locations or open the box in units of bananas, like in units of its rewards, currency? And so this is the likelihood surface of the data, the simulated data that we have. And this is just to show that, hey, we can go to the peak and we can find the most probable explanation of that data. And when we do so, because this is a synthetic animal, we know all of its true assumptions and we can recover them very well. And moreover, given that model, we can then estimate the beliefs over time. So this is actually a probability of beliefs as a function of time. So probability of probabilities, which is kind of fun. And you can see that the blue line, which is the true beliefs, are nicely tracked by the white or gray scale, which is our posterior over those beliefs. And so there's a pretty nice agreement between the actual belief and the estimated belief when you marginalize over these things. So we're doing a pretty good job based on this pretty complicated optimization problem. And so you get things like close to the right action distributions and locations and times and stuff. Now, with that artificial agent, I want to do the next step in this process, which is to look inside the brain. Okay. This is ultimately our goal. We designed this whole framework for explaining behavior and mind reading the animal precisely to be able to explain brain activity. So how would this work? What would we do? First, let me just tell you about the neural coding framework. So I like to think about the neural coding as these three overlapping processes of encoding, recoding, and decoding. Encoding is relating how the neurons respond to the stimuli, relating the responses to the stimuli. Decoding is relating the neurons to behavior, like motor side. And recoding is asking how do the neurons transform information? Okay, how do they change over time? And back to this picture, you can see that the encoding is going to be the relationship between the beliefs that we impute by this inverse rational control, relating that to the neurons. What's that relationship? Decoding can we predict the actions that are taken from those neural states, or in particular, from the beliefs that are encoded in that those neurons. So we take the beliefs, we compress it down to our best neural estimate, and then we predict the action from that. And then the recoding is asking how that information in the neurons changes over time. And so if we understood these processes, then we understand a lot about what the brain is doing. If we have behavioral variables, then we can extract them by fitting from the brain, and we cross-validate it, then we're happy. We feel like we can understand the encoding of this. If the interactions between the variables in the behavioral model match the interactions between those neural encodings, then we can argue that we understand computation or the recoding process. If the actions that we predict from the behavioral model, the actions from the actual animal, agree with the actions predicted from the neural activity, specifically the neural beliefs, then we can say that we understand something important about decoding, the process by which the brain uses its information. So here, in order to create a synthetic monkey, we took a neural network, a simple artificial neural network that was recurrent, and it has some sort of belief updates over here that it doesn't have to be beliefs, but some updates here, some nonlinear units here that give you a policy, that is probabilities of moving and looking in the boxes, etc. And that's our architecture. In fact, I have on here the target belief. That is not what we used in the final version. I should take that out, because all we did was we trained this network using supervised learning to match an ideal agent doing one task. But the actual data that we're going to look at this animal doing is going to be from a different task. So this is an agent that is rational, it's optimal for one task, but it's tested on a different task. So it's making the wrong assumptions when it actually does the experiment. So we would like to infer that that agent is doing this other thing. And what I showed you before is that it was. And now what we'll do is we'll look inside the brain of this system. And so, yeah, this just says that the neural agent does reproduce the agent. Neural network. Okay, so this is the encoding model in purple here. You have the belief predicted from behavior on the horizontal axis, and the neural belief predicted by cross-validation from the encoding model on the vertical axis. And you can see that we have some good agreement there. Then we look at the dynamics. This is the change in the belief according to the behavior, compared to the change in belief according to the neurons. And again, you see a nice diagonal line. Good agreement. And then finally, we can predict the probability of different actions according to the behavior and the probability according to the neurons. And a pretty good diagonal line. So this shows how we could use this encoding framework and the inverse rational control to infer targets that we look for their dynamics in the brain. A geometric picture that I think is useful in this case is that there's a lot of activity that's irrelevant. And out of all that activity in the brain that's irrelevant, we only really care about the task relevant stuff. All of the other dimensions, like this green arrow here is task irrelevant. Those other dimensions, you can take any other value that you want in those coordinates But as long as the task relevant coordinates agree, then you're doing the same thing for the task. Okay. And so you can basically trace out this entire ribbon. Technically, this is a foliation of the manifold of neural activity. And the ribbon is tracing, if you compress the ribbon down to this, just the orange curve on the top, those are the task relevant coordinates. And that's what we care about. Now, let me show you a little bit of the neural data. Here's the, Here's the neural data. The monkey has these two boxes. It's actually got eye tracking in there too, so we can see what it's looking at. It's getting food. We're recording, in this case, from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is a higher order area that kind of does decision-making, abstract thinking, that type of thing. We have a bed of nails Utah array implanted in there. And when I say we, this is all Valentin Dragoy's lab. This is done by Neda Shahidi. And then we have a wireless transmitter, which is just beaming the signals over to a receiver somewhere else. So the animal is just untethered, doing whatever it wants. And this is what some of the data would look like. Here's just a handful of the neurons. And so time going left to right, different neurons going up and down. And now the animal is doing different things. So here it pushes the button at box 1, and then it pushes again at this time, but then switches from box 1 to box 2. And then over here it pushes at box 2 and gets rewarded. What we would like to predict is when the monkey is not rewarded after it looks in the box, does it stay or switch? And we'd like to do that based on this kind of framework of neural decoding. So which do you think will predict the animal's choices the best? One, the true probability, according to this switching process, that the monkey actually gets the food, or from looking at all the neurons themselves. Who thinks A? All right, who thinks B? Who is too hesitant to raise your hand? Okay, so the B's have it by a little bit. It's not very significant. Now, you can predict like 10% of the switches above chance. Now, what if we take the neural data, which has all the information that we're going to get, and we try to decode the thing that didn't predict things very well? We try to decode the true reward probability from the neural activity. Okay, so we've done a dimensionality reduction from this big neural space down to this littler space, which seems to be a bit wrong for predicting. And now we see how well that subspace of neural activity directed at sort of the wrong thing, how well that predicts the animal's choice. And remember, this is a reduction of the information in the neurons, which has all the information that we're going to get. We're going to reduce it to a subspace that is not as good as all the neurons. And we do better at predicting what the animal will do. So I think that this is kind of curious, that you're able to reduce all of the activity to sort of the wrong thing and do better at predicting. What this tells me is that there's information in the neurons about that variable, but that there's also variability, also noise in that dimension, which is even more influential on the choice. And if you try to decode it without knowing which dimensions might matter, you're going to be overfitting, and you're going to find all sorts of wrong fluctuations that seem in your tested training data to correlate with the choice, but are really just pure noise. And so by reducing the dimensionality this way, you can isolate more of the fluctuations that actually drive the choice of the animal. So I think that this is really exciting. We're still in the process of applying this inverse rational control to monkey data, but combining all these different ideas of doing the analysis of behavior and then combining it with neural coding, we hope that we'll be able to get a better picture of what the animal is thinking as it does these tasks. All right, so I'm wrapping up here. The existing methods for data-driven dimensionality reduction are good, you like them, but they're not interpretable. This is interpretable because it can be related to task relevant variables. So that's a major benefit, right? Latent variable methods, deep networks, they don't have this property. We use cognitive inspired models, like what you should do, normative models, or even suboptimal but structured cognitive models to provide interpretable components. So I think that this is really important as we gather more data in more complex tasks. And so you can term this like scientific machine learning or explainable AI. There's a number of ways that you could think about this. And finally, to your question, we assumed a model family, which includes a complete posterior. And what if you have to learn that representation? And can we infer how behavior would be influenced by different things that you might learn? Right? These are important open questions. So big picture, we talked about inference and control, a mathematical framework for this. We talked about neural coding, encoding, recoding, and decoding, which talked about where the information is represented, how it's dynamic, and how it influences behavior. And we provided a tool that infers a model that best explains an animal's behavior and latent beliefs. And we've started applying this to behavioral neuroscience tasks. And we're seeing some interesting evidence of distributed codes for the latent beliefs that we think might be there. And with that, I want to thank again the people who worked so hard to make all of this possible. And thank you for your attention.
In the forage problem, how does the belief depend on the parameter theta? Is there some kind of Gaussian distribution, or you need a graphical model?
So in this case, there is a binary latent variable at each box. So the belief is the probability that that binary variable is 1 at this current time, given all of the observations that you made in the past, including the view of the color on the screen. That's the representation.
Yeah, but we don't want to infer theta, right? Which is a parameter of the agent.
Right. So theta will determine, here's where we go for chalk. So this is the probability that food is available now. And let's say it goes from 1 to 0. And let's say that at time 0, you just opened the box and you looked, and either there was food and you ate it, now there's not food anymore, or it was empty anyway. Now this Markov process will grow in its probability to some level, which has some time constant tau and some b infinity, both of which are determined by the model parameters, which is how fast, like what's the probability of going from none to no to yes, and the probability of going from yes to no. Those are the two parameters, and they affect these beliefs.
In your simulated monkey experiment, you're creating a model that is tracking this thing. I can't remember what the words are. What are the inputs to that model that you're building of the monkeys, the simulated monkey's belief?
The observations that the monkey gets.
So just you see what the monkey sees or something.
Yeah, that's right.
And the model you have to build up your belief model, how is the complexity or like the depth of that compared to what went into building the monkey's behavior in the first place?
I don't quite follow the question.
Like, you showed this diagram of here's how we built the monkey and what it does. It's like,
Oh, you mean the little neural network thing?
Yeah. And like how complicated is the model you use to then build your belief of it? Are they
This thing is a more complicated model than it sort of depends on what nonlinearities you allow. This part here so if you're going to integrate evidence, it can only be done really here, because this is the part that's recurrent. And this is a generic, like 300 neurons, the ReLUs. It's very flexible. If you train it enough, it could do lots of stuff. Then you have the policy network, which is 2 layers, and it has to map from whatever this belief representation is down to a probability over 5 different actions. And so that's, again, pretty, I mean, a two-layer network, you kind of know how complicated that thing is going to be. It's not that complicated. It can only have like a few bends in it. And the optimal policy is something that we can infer directly using the Bellman equation, which is a recursion equation that tells you what the value is given the past, or given the rewards and the dynamics. So they're kind of incommensurate, but the dimensionality of this is much higher than the dimensionality of the than the POMDP, the partially observable Markov decision process. But the nonlinearity that you need is smoother in that case, and you can just write it down exactly in terms of the value. There's a chat question, let's see. Let's see it out here. Okay, Vijay asks, do I take into account the inherent behavior predetermined by genetics? Should we not start with simpler animals than monkeys? So that's a good question. In fact, we are applying this right now to worms, to mice, to monkeys, and to humans. And sometimes we adapt the particular, I mean, always, we adapt the task to the animals, the animal of interest. We're not asking worms to open boxes, but we do have them squiggling through a series of columns to pass through a gradient and find more food. And the columns get tighter and tighter in some places, so we can control the action cost. So there are ways of adapting this. And so, yeah, I think that's it's a very interesting question. Now, in terms of the genetics that are predetermined, I think this is a really deep question, because here we have some neural network that's pretty flexible. And we have universal function approximator theorems that say, if you're given enough neurons, you can do anything to arbitrary precision. But the problem is that if you then train such a thing to give you a good function, given some available data, and then you ask it for generalization, you give it a new task that it's never seen before, or you just don't give it as much data as you would like to train it to completion, you will get different answers for different networks. Each network has its own inductive bias, which means a learning bias, or what do you learn from the data? How do you map the data into the parameters? And so if you have a different consequence of the same data, you will generalize differently. And so the part of what our genetic legacy gives us is a good inductive bias. And one of the core questions about the study of intelligence is, what is a good inductive bias? How do we achieve a good inductive bias? And so maybe by looking at some of the foundational questions here, we'll be able to get to that. In particular, we've designed these tasks in such a way as to highlight certain features which I think are crucial for behavior in the wild, which is nonlinear dynamics, distributed processing, weighing uncertainty, things like these. And so we designed this task specifically to challenge those kinds of computations. Yeah.
So ask you quickly, if you go back to the decoding of the monkey neural data, I understand that you found a reduced, like a sort of set of reduced dimensions that do a good job at predicting the animal's behavior. So at the end, when you sort of had the three colors, you had the actual prediction.
The actual monkey stuff.
Yeah. So the actual monkey stuff. So this is like familiar territory for me. So I want to figure out how these relate. So the true task variables don't do a very good job. The total population dynamics don't do a very good job, but you can find a reduced space that does do a good job predicting. So
yes,
how does the model that you're using, or that reduced space, reflect the sort of theoretical model that you've set up? Like how are those things stitched together?
Right now we haven't so if we replace true task variables, like the probability of reward, with belief, then that would be an application of this. Right now, we're still applying the inverse rational control to the monkey data. And so until I finish that, we can't actually test this. But on the other hand, we've tested a couple different variants here, which include, the true task variables here are not just the probability of reward, but also the recent history of reward, which for an ideal observer is irrelevant. but for the monkey, it actually matters. And so you can see that not just the probability of reward, which really is all that you need, but also the number of losses that you've had recently, that influences the choice. And so that contributes to this.
Does that recent history actually change the shape of the reduced dimensional space or the actual dimensions that it's?
Yeah,
Because you'd
so
almost expect like
what
that
we
would be a
do
belief
technically
opening.
here is canonical correlation analysis
Yep.
on 2 dimensions, probability of reward and loss history. And then we look at those 2 dimensions and we see whether we can decode from those 2 dimensions. The loss history is a suboptimal belief that actually has a rational basis if you make a certain assumption about how your actions affect the reward, like if you deplete a certain way. And if time becomes, if the outcomes are independent of time, but only dependent on your actions, then that is the sufficient statistic and therefore the belief. So this is kind of a hybrid model, which includes the belief implicitly in there. We didn't do the full-fledged like IRC thing, but it's in here. And that is informative about these.
Cool.
Yeah. Yes.
What are the tasks for humans in this model?
So we have humans, so far we've just done this on students.
So not humans.
But we're getting this ready to go into the epilepsy monitoring unit. And so we have neurosurgical patients. Actually, we have 2 cohorts of patients, epilepsy patients and severe treatment resistant depression patients. And so they have an iPad and they have a couple of circles that have some pictures on them of like the reward, like a color basically. And they have to move a little dot around the screen to try to collect rewards. And so it's very much the foraging task. They have to like tap to get the reward and they have some time that it takes to go between the boxes. So the mathematical structure of it is identical to what I presented here. It's just that the interface, instead of having them walk around freely with a giant like bandage on their head and like electrodes coming out here, there, and everywhere else, they're just sitting in their bed playing an iPad game.
No snacks.
Hmm?
No snacks.
No snacks. I've talked to the people about this. Like, are they motivated by things? I think that they're, in the hospital, they're very constrained on what they're able to do. So yeah, no snacks. But they can get points, and that's just as good, right?
Could I interpret what you're doing as saying, okay, I can do machine learning stuff, I can train up neural networks, they do amazing things, but I don't like not understanding what they're up to. So can I cook up a model where I can understand the pieces because I invented it myself, and it's sort of an understandable thing, and can I fit this model to this mysterious neural network and end up with something that performs equally well, but I can understand and sort of explain it?
I agree almost up to the performs equally well because, I mean.
Optimistic, I'm just giving the most optimistic.
Well, the thing that I would distinguish there is not the performance, but that it's actually describing the trial by trial fluctuations of that model. So it's not just the
Performs the same.
Hmm?
Performs the same, not equally well, but the same performance.
It's
Behaves the same.
yes, it has the same outputs.
Okay.
That's right.
So it's
And I
then
wanted
we
to
can summarize
distinguish
it. Okay.
performance and behavior.
So it's sort of making sense of it, if you like.
That's right. This is all about interpreting so that we can look for, like, we can measure thoughts, so we can look for them in the brain and figure out how they're moving around. That's everything here is dedicated to interpretation. That's right. If you have a better interpretation, in some sense, I can try to fold that into my model. It might be that this is like way overpowered for the kind of interpretation that we would need for some other model. It might also be that there's some even more complicated model that deals with individual neurons and ion channels and synapses. And if you can constrain all that, then you could explain even tinier fluctuations. So we're trying to explain the task relevant fluctuations and abstract away the other details. That's the goal. There might be other ways to do it, but this is a nice general way that has clear assumptions and clear consequences.
So this I probably want to last question, so I get to ask an outlandish one. So to what extent do you think
soul?
Close. So to what extent do you think this rational control idea is a product of brain evolution? And do you think this would have any implications for brain anatomy? Like, are there regions of the brain that you need more neurons to do this, or could you predict those even?
Yes, so this is a really crucial question. Right now, this is rational in a sense of like maybe having some wrong assumptions, but it's not constrained by biology. I don't need to have a separate hippocampus, and so like whatever I want to do to solve the problem that I set up, I can solve it. You might, in addition, put in some bounds or constraints, biological constraints. And we're working on that problem too, which we call inverse bounded rational control. So now maybe your memory is only so many bits, or you're not allowed to use a full dynamic range, you need to reformat it. And that means that you lose information. So that changes the stochasticity or the temperature associated with the dynamics. And you might have microcircuit architecture that makes certain kinds of nonlinear transformations easy and other ones hard. Again, the inductive bias. So we have other projects that are interested in what are inductive biases that come from biology. And sometime, 20 years from now, I can imagine integrating those two. I don't know, maybe I can be optimistic. Let's say 2 years. To integrate all of that into some holistic picture of a computationally constrained controller that is interpretable. That's the dream.
We had one more question from a student there.
Yes. Do you think there's any hope in the future of like looking of looking at a brain, like going off of Mark's question about falsifying this, like if you pick some particular neural architecture, do you think we'll ever have access to microscopic details that can say, yes, this is right, or no, this is wrong?
Yeah, I think we can definitely test this.
Do you think like in our lifetime?
Yeah. I mean, my collaborator has recorded from 100,000 neurons in one animal at the same time. He's working with somebody else at Columbia. So Ali Pasha Vaziri has just created a microscope that records from 1 million neurons at the same time. That's slow. It's on the order of like 2 hertz. Fundamentally, there's a limited calcium that they're using for this at about 10 hertz, but people are working on voltage imaging and multi-photon acquisition that allow you to get deep recordings at like I would say 10 milliseconds would make me really happy. Of course, once we get to 10 milliseconds and I don't get all of my hypotheses validated, then I'll complain and I'll say go to 1 millisecond. But there's incredible progress in the neurotechnology, and so I think that at least for me to find satisfying answers, I don't need to go down to quarks or even ion channels. I'm very satisfied with, because there's so much degeneracy and sloppiness in like many ways of solving the same problem, and the deep, like let's say you have 10 neurons that all have the same information. I don't really care, I mean, unless I'm a pharmaceutical company, which one of those 10 neurons actually gets used, or if it's an average of all 10, or like, these 5 minus twice those plus, whatever the influence of those are. As long as it has an equivalent input-output function up to the noise floor, I feel like that's understandable. I feel like that's at least capturing the variability that we can possibly capture. And if, in addition, interpretability helps us get there, because like with this data, it eliminates a bunch of extraneous things that don't actually matter for the task, I think that would be a major boon.
Do you believe a brain is a literal neural net, or is it just approximated a brain?
Well, okay, so maybe there's a language play here, like neural network, like artificial neural network.
Yeah, like sort of, is it an exact?
I mean, it's a network made of neurons. So yes, it's a neural. Those neurons are very different than half-wave rectifiers. And in fact, we're designing new neural networks that have richer expressivity. Like they have multiple inputs, an apical and a basal dendrite, which are able to interact in some way that gives you gating and not just a sum with positive answers. So yeah, I think that the brain has much more of that structure in it. And as always in science, the goal is to find the right level of abstraction that allows us to capture the core details while eliminating the extraneous, the core concepts while eliminating the extraneous details.
Well, on this positive note, I think we stop here. I know there are more questions, but maybe we do the rest afterwards. And so thank you very much.
Cool.